Before we meet the British soldiers in these pages, we should meet the men who wrote about them. German soldiers. Young men mostly. Some students. Some farmers. Some clerks from Munich or Hamburg, who never imagined they'd spend months living in the cold earth of Flanders or the Somme. They carried notebooks. Small, leather-bound things, often tucked into breast pockets or kept wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the rain. And in the evenings, by candlelight or the glow of a distant flare, they wrote. Not always grand observations. Often just fragments. A line or two. A sketch. A date. The weather. The sameness of the days pressing down on them. But sometimes, they wrote about the men across no man's land. The British. Die Englander. The enemy. And yet, the tone in these diaries is often curious. Even respectful. There's a strange intimacy that happens in war, you see. When you spend months facing the same stretch of trench, the same silhouettes moving at dusk, the same voices drifting across on quiet nights, the enemy becomes familiar. One soldier, a man named Karl, wrote in his diary in 1916. We hear them singing sometimes. Strange songs. But not unpleasant. Another, named Friedrich, sketched a British soldier in profile, a man he'd glimpsed during a brief, unspoken ceasefire to recover the wounded. He labeled it simply, Ein Engländer. An Englishman. The face is careful. Almost kind. These were not men writing propaganda. They were writing for themselves. For memory. For sanity, perhaps. And so the observations are raw. Honest. Unfiltered. They noticed what the British ate. How they moved. How they joked. How they endured the same rain, the same mud, the same cold that the Germans endured. There's something deeply human in that, isn't there? To see your enemy, and recognize yourself. The diaries weren't meant to be read by us. They were private. Personal. Many were found decades later, tucked in attics or donated to archives by families who barely understood what they contained. But now, we can read them. And in the quiet of tonight, we can listen to what those men saw. The ink has faded. The pages have yellowed. But the words remain. And in the stillness of a trench at dawn, a German soldier leans against the cold earth, pen in hand, watching. One of the most striking things in these diaries is surprise. The Germans had been told what to expect. The British were the enemy. Professional soldiers. Cold. Calculating. Imperial. The British Lion, they called them in the newspapers. Ruthless. Unstoppable. But when German soldiers first encountered British troops up close, the reality was different. A soldier named Otto wrote in 1914, after his first real engagement. They are not giants. They are men like us. Some are tall. Some are short. Some look tired. One of them had a photograph pinned inside his helmet. I saw it when we took him prisoner. A woman and a child. That detail, a photograph, it appears again and again in German accounts. The British carried photos. Letters. Small personal things. And when those things were found, the German soldiers noticed. Another diary entry from a man named Werner describes a captured British soldier who spoke a little German. They talked briefly. The British soldier was from Manchester. He worked in a factory before the war. He had a dog named Bertie. Werner wrote. He seemed ordinary. I don't know what I expected. But it was not this. That word. Ordinary. It's a word that echoes through these diaries. The British weren't monsters. They weren't faceless. They were bakers and clerks and farmhands, just like the Germans. They missed home. They were scared. They were brave. They were human. Some German soldiers noted the British sense of humor. Even under fire, the British joked. They sang bawdy songs. They gave each other nicknames. One diary mentions hearing laughter from a British trench after a shell landed harmlessly in the mud. They laughed, the soldier wrote. We did not understand why. But we heard it clearly. There's something almost tender in the way these observations are recorded. The Germans also noticed discipline. The British were often well organized. Their trenches were neat. Their routines were precise. But there was also a looseness, a camaraderie, that the more rigid German command structure didn't always allow. One diary entry describes a British patrol moving at night. The German soldier watched them through a gap in the sandbags. He noted how quietly they moved. How careful they were. Professional, he wrote. But also weary. You could see it in the way they walked. And then there's this, a letter from a soldier named Hans, written in late 1916. He describes a moment during a temporary ceasefire. Both sides were burying their dead. A British soldier offered him a cigarette. Hans took it. They didn't speak. They couldn't. But they stood there for a moment, two men in the mud, smoking. Hans wrote, I thought he would hate me. But his face was only tired. Like mine. These first impressions, they complicate everything, don't they? Because when you see the enemy as human, when you notice the photograph in the helmet, the joke in the trench, the exhaustion in the eyes, it becomes harder to hate. And perhaps that's why these diaries were kept private. Outside, the rain begins to fall softly, tapping on the tin roofs of the dugouts, and the night settles in. The Germans were fascinated by British routines. Especially, tea. Tea appears in German diaries with remarkable frequency. It clearly puzzled them. Amused them, even. One soldier, named Ludwig, wrote, No matter the circumstance, no matter the shelling, the British stop for tea. It is like a religion for them. Another entry, from a diary found in a Leipzig archive, describes a captured British position. The Germans moved in cautiously, expecting traps. Instead, they found a small stove still warm, a tin kettle, and half-drunk cups of tea scattered on a wooden crate. They left in a hurry, the soldier wrote. But they had made tea first. It's funny, isn't it? But also strangely touching. Tea was a ritual. A small piece of normalcy. A way to hold on to something gentle in a world gone mad. The Germans noticed other things too. British rations, for instance. The British ate better than the Germans did, especially in the later years of the war. The diaries mentioned tinned meat, jam, biscuits, chocolate even. One soldier wrote enviously, Their supplies are good. We captured a crate yesterday. Inside were tins of beef and small cakes wrapped in paper. We shared them. They tasted of England, I think. Sweet and strange. But it wasn't just food. The Germans observed how the British organized their trenches. The duckboards laid carefully over the mud. The small personal touches, a pinned-up newspaper cartoon, a makeshift shelf for letters, a flower stuck in a sandbag, wilting but still there. One diary entry describes a British trench system captured near Ypres. The German soldier was struck by how, lived in it felt. They had made it a home, he wrote. As much as one can, in such a place. There were routines, too. The British had stand to at dawn and dusk, just like the Germans. Sentries rotated. Patrols went out. Mail was delivered when it could be. And in the quiet hours, men wrote letters. Played cards. Sang. A soldier named Ernst noted the singing especially. He wrote that British songs were often melancholy. Slow. They sing about home, he observed. About women and fields in England. We do the same. It is strange how similar we are. Sometimes, the routines overlapped in darkly comedic ways. During quiet periods, both sides would repair their trenches, hang laundry, cook meals, all within sight of each other. One German soldier described watching a British soldier shaving in a cracked mirror propped against the trench wall. He nicked himself, the diary says. I saw him curse. I laughed. I could not help it. These small moments, they accumulate. They paint a picture not of war as we imagine it, all fire and fury, but of war as it actually was. Long stretches of boredom. Small comforts. Routines clinging to sanity. And through it all, the observation. The noticing. The Germans saw the British not as an abstraction, but as men boiling water for tea, mending socks, writing letters home by candlelight. Men just like them. The diaries don't glorify this. They simply record it. And in that recording, there's a quiet kind of truth. Outside the trench, the evening settles, the smell of wet earth and smoke drifting through the air, and somewhere, a kettle whistles softly. Sometimes, the war paused. Not officially. Not in any grand way. But in small, fleeting moments, the fighting stopped. And in those moments, the British and the Germans met. The most famous, of course, is the Christmas truce of 1914. But the German diaries reveal that truces, informal, unspoken, happen more often than history books tend to say. A soldier named Paul wrote about one such moment in the winter of 1915. Shelling had stopped. The snow was falling. And from the British trench, someone began to sing. A carol. Silent Night, perhaps, or something like it. The Germans listened. Then they joined in. Paul wrote, "For a few minutes, we were not enemies. We were simply men, cold and tired, singing the same song." Another diary entry describes a moment in the spring of 1916. A British soldier ventured into no man's land to retrieve a wounded comrade. The Germans held their fire. When he returned safely, someone on the German side shouted, "Good man!" in broken English. The British soldier paused, raised a hand, then disappeared back into his trench. These moments, they weren't common. But they happened. And the Germans wrote about them carefully. Almost reverently. There were also exchanges. During quiet periods, soldiers on both sides would sometimes leave items in no man's land. Cigarettes. Chocolate. Newspapers. A diary from 1917 mentions finding a small tin of British tobacco left near a shell crater. Beside it, a note in awkward German, "Für Euch." Viel Glück. For you. Good luck. The German soldier took the tobacco. The next night, he left a bottle of schnapps in the same spot. It was gone by morning. These were not grand gestures. They changed nothing about the war. But they meant something. A soldier named Helmut wrote about capturing a British position in 1918. Among the abandoned supplies, he found a letter half-written. It began, "Dear Mother, I hope this finds you well." Helmut didn't finish reading it. He folded it carefully and left it where he found it. "It felt wrong," he wrote, "to read a man's words to his mother. There's something unbearably sad in that, isn't there? The recognition that the man who wrote that letter, who thought of his mother, was someone's son. Someone loved. Not all encounters were gentle, of course. The diaries also record bitterness, anger, fear. There were moments of cruelty on both sides. War is not a place where kindness thrives easily. But what's striking is how often the humanity appeared anyway. A German soldier named George described taking a British prisoner in 1917. The man was young, frightened, shaking. George gave him water, shared a piece of bread. "He reminded me of my brother," George wrote. "I could not look at him without thinking of home." These moments of contact, they didn't end the war. They didn't stop the killing. But they linger in the diaries. They linger because they remind us that even in the worst of circumstances, even when nations demand hatred, people sometimes choose something else. Not always. Not even often. But sometimes. And in the quiet of a frozen field, under a sky heavy with stars, Two soldiers stand for a moment, breathing the same cold air, and then turn back to their separate worlds. As the war dragged on, the tone of the diaries began to shift. The early curiosity, the surprise, gave way to something heavier. Respect. Weariness. And sometimes, a kind of quiet grief. A soldier named Albert wrote in 1918, near the end of the war, "We have fought the British for 4 years. I no longer hate them. I am not sure I ever did. I only wish it would end." That sentiment, it appears again and again. The Germans didn't stop seeing the British as the enemy. But they stopped seeing them as monsters. One diary entry, written after a particularly brutal engagement near Passchendaele, describes the aftermath. Bodies lying in the mud. British and German alike. The soldier who wrote it couldn't tell them apart at first. "The mud covered them all," he wrote. "It made us the same." There's a loss in that line. A kind of surrender to the horror. But there's also recognition. The Germans respected British courage. That comes through clearly. They noted how the British fought stubbornly, even when outnumbered. How they held positions longer than seemed possible. How they kept going, even when exhausted. A soldier named Matthias wrote about a British unit that defended a ridge for 3 days straight. When the Germans finally overran the position, only a handful of British soldiers were still alive. Matthias wrote, "They did not run. Even at the end they stood. I respected that." But respect didn't erase the sadness. Many of the diaries, especially from the later years, are filled with exhaustion. The writers were tired. The British were tired. Everyone was tired. One soldier wrote simply, "We are all dying here. British, German, it does not matter. The war eats us all." After the war ended, some of the diaries continue. And in those later entries, there's reflection.